Tapes 4, 5, and 6 come with their own set of markings and dates, a detail worth noting as it appears that subsequent recordings become increasingly disorganized. For those who've inquired about the timeline, it seems my grandfather initiated this archival project around 1960. Interestingly, a quick Google search reveals that cassette tapes weren't even invented until 1963. This leads me to speculate that my grandfather must have initially gathered these stories orally and only later recorded them, for the sake of preservation. The parallel between his archiving efforts and my current endeavor gives me a sense of a historical connection between us. Diverging from the content of the initial trio of tapes, these next 3 recordings focus more on everyday people, likely individuals who lived near my grandfather or had some personal association with him. As always, your insights are invaluable to me. Please don't hesitate to comment if you catch anything noteworthy. Thank you for all your contributions so far.
The following account is from Peter Gable. Peter is the local mechanic for the town I live in. Peter told me this story after a few drinks loosened his tongue, though he was quite sober while telling it. This is his story. I've been a mechanic for 20 years, and I thought I'd seen all kinds of breakdowns, cars, trucks, even people. But nothing prepared me for that night, the night I walked home and something walked with me. The shop had closed late, and I just said goodbye to the boys. Tired but satisfied, I locked up and started on the 3-mile trek back to my little house at the edge of town. It was a quiet night, moon nearly full, the kind of quiet you get used to living out here. But about halfway home, that quiet changed. I felt it more than heard it, like a storm rolling in. The air turned thick, almost hard to breathe. I stopped, looked around, but didn't see anything unusual, so I shook it off and kept going. Then I heard it. A low growl, distant yet so visceral it rattled my bones. I've never been superstitious, but something primal in me said, "Run!" Still, years of working in a garage had given me a stubbornness thicker than motor oil. I walked on, quickening my pace, but refusing to let fear dictate me. As I neared the old bridge that marked the halfway point, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. Shadows danced on the walls, but not like tree branches swaying in the wind. These were frenetic, jagged. Then they coalesced into a shape, a tall humanoid form that seemed to twitch and writhe as if struggling to maintain its form. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes, God, its eyes were like burning coals. It seemed to smile, and then, in a flash, it was gone. The shadows returned to their usual benign dance. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer. Rational thought told me it was a trick of the light, but gut instinct screamed otherwise. I bolted across that bridge like a bat out of hell, boots pounding the weathered boards, the growl now a deafening roar in my ears. I was almost home when I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace perfectly. I ran faster, and so did they, a synchronous drumbeat of dread. The air turned icy. My breath came out in visible puffs, as if winter had come months early. I couldn't turn around. I knew if I saw it, I'd be lost. So I focused on the path ahead, my house now in sight. Finally, I burst through my front door, slammed it shut, and locked every bolt and chain. I leaned against the door, heart still racing, my senses alert. I waited, listening for any sign that it had followed me home, but heard nothing. Silence had returned, but it was no longer comforting. It was the silence of an unspeakable void. I never spoke of that night to anyone, tried to convince myself it was a hallucination born from exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew better. I still walk home sometimes, but never on a full moon night, and never without casting wary glances at the shifting shadows. Because whatever that thing was, it's still out there, lurking in the dark places of the world and in the corners of my mind. And I know, somehow, that it waits for me, patient as death, eager for our next unholy rendezvous.
After listening to this tape, I decided to look into Peter myself and see if he was still alive. From what I can tell, he went on a camping trip by himself and was never seen again. His daughter states the last communication from him was a phone call that she did not get to answer in time.
The following account is from David Moss. David lives in Waterford, just over the state border. He was told to reach out to me, and I am glad he did. This is his story. Working late at the factory wasn't unusual for me. The grind of machines and the smell of oil was my life, and I took pride in clocking those extra hours. But that night, something felt off as I clocked out, the punch card leaving an uneasy echo in the empty break room. I left the building, pulling my worn jacket tighter against the night's chill. The parking lot was empty, save for a few straggler cars, their owners likely still working inside. My footsteps on the asphalt seemed louder than usual, each echo cutting through the silence like a knife. Then I noticed it, the sound of another set of footsteps. I paused. They paused. I resumed my walk, and so did they. Each step seemed calculated, deliberately mimicking mine. I quickened my pace, almost breaking into a jog as I turned the corner onto the deserted main street. The footsteps behind me did the same. With a bolt of courage, I spun around, but saw nothing. Just an empty street, lined with closed shops and darkened windows. "You're getting paranoid," I muttered to myself and continued walking. The rest of the journey was the same cat-and-mouse game. I'd hear the footsteps, quicken my pace, then turn to find no one. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally reached my front porch, fumbling for my keys while throwing glances over my shoulder. That's when I saw him. A silhouette standing at the far end of the street, partially obscured by a flickering streetlight. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and his posture was rigid, unnerving. Our eyes met, or at least I think they did. Even from that distance, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Then he stepped back, vanishing into the darkness, as if swallowed by the night itself. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. For the first time, my own home felt like a stranger's place, every creak of the floorboards and gust of wind causing me to jump. I sat in my living room, the television blaring mindlessly, but my thoughts were on that eerie figure. Days turned into weeks, and life returned to its routine. But I never stayed late at the factory anymore, always looking over my shoulder as I walked the shortest route home. The eerie presence never reappeared, but the memory never faded. Eventually, I bumped into a co-worker who used to work the late shift with me. He looked troubled, visibly aged since I last saw him. When I asked what was wrong, he hesitated, finally whispering that he'd been walking home late one night and felt like he was being followed. He described the same tall silhouette, the same eerie feeling of eyes drilling into him. The only difference was, he said the man had gotten closer each time he turned around, always just a step behind, but never quite there. I don't know who or what that figure was, but knowing that I wasn't alone in my experience was somehow even more unsettling. The factory still stands, its machines grinding away as people clock in and out. But there's an unspoken rule among those who know. You never walk home alone, especially not after dark. And if you ever hear footsteps behind you, whatever you do, don't turn around. Because sometimes what you can't see is far more terrifying than what you can. The following is a tale from Nicholas Cooper. Nicholas is a well-known hunter, though his reputation has taken quite a hit in the last few years. His story was recounted to me after he cautioned me from hunting in the nearby woods. This is his story. I've been a hunter for years, but there's one memory that still haunts me, keeps me up at night, and makes me question what lurks in the depths of the wilderness. It was late autumn, a time when the forest is more shadows than anything else. I had been out hunting deer in the backwoods. The day was unsuccessful, but as a seasoned hunter, I knew that was part of the game. Dusk was settling in, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon. I shouldered my rifle and began my trek back to the cabin. The path was familiar, but in the fading light, every twisted tree and obscured rock seemed foreign. That's when I heard it, soft rustling coming from behind me, leaves being crushed, twigs snapping. I figured it was just another animal, perhaps a raccoon or maybe a coyote. I tightened my grip on my rifle just to be safe. I continued walking, but the rustling grew louder, closer. Now it sounded heavy, deliberate. An eerie feeling washed over me. This was no ordinary animal. I increased my pace, clutching my rifle like a lifeline. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I swung around, my rifle aimed and finger on the trigger. Nothing. The forest was as still as death, the only sound my own labored breathing. Convincing myself it was my imagination, I turned back and nearly jumped out of my skin. Not 10 feet in front of me was a creature, tall and grotesquely slender, its body covered in what looked like tattered rags. It had unnaturally long limbs and fingers that almost touched the ground. But its face, oh God, its face, was a void of darkness, as if the very night had swallowed its features. Our eyes locked, or at least I felt they did, as it had no eyes to see. A feeling of dread engulfed me, as if the creature was peeling layers off my very soul. Then, in an instant, it lunged to the side, disappearing into the thick brush. Shaken to my core, I ran. Adrenaline fueled my body as I sprinted down the path, my cabin finally coming into view. I burst through the door, slamming it shut and locking every bolt I had. That night, I sat in bed, rifle at my side, listening to every creak and moan of the cabin, praying it was just the wind. I've never seen that creature again, but the memory remains vivid as ever. I've heard locals talk in hushed tones about the Dark Walker, a creature of the night, a wraith that stalks these woods. Some say it's a myth, others believe it's a harbinger of doom. For me, it's a stark reminder that we are not always the hunters. Sometimes we are the hunted. I still venture into the woods, but never without looking over my shoulder. Never without remembering that autumn night when something inhuman stalked me, and never without wondering if it'll come back to claim what it couldn't take that night.